Okay, so the directions are asking me to measure 2 milliliters of hydrogen peroxide. So using my graduated cylinder, I'm going to measure 2 milliliters of hydrogen peroxide. And I need a little bit more. And there we have 2 milliliters of hydrogen peroxide. Now, I have to get a piece of liver, a piece of freshly cut up liver. I cut this up earlier today, bought a pound of liver from the grocery store. And I'm going to put a piece of liver into test tube number 1. I've labeled my test tubes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So I'm going to put a piece into test tube number 1. And I'll probably have to push the liver all the way down to the bottom of the test tube with my stirring rod here. And let me turn the test tubes around so you can see them better. So here we have on the far right, this is test tube number 1. Okay, now the directions tell me to add the 2 milliliters of peroxide. I'm going to add the 2 milliliters of peroxide into test tube number 1, and we need to observe the reaction of what happens. Here we go. You can see that bubbles have formed, and the bubbles go almost all the way to the top, of the test tube. You can see there's some tape at the top of the test tube here, but the bubbles go about an inch, all the way to about an inch to the top. I'm also asked to feel the bottom of the test tube. Feel the bottom of the test tube to see if it feels warmer or cooler to the touch. And by doing this, I can figure out if this is an endothermic or an exothermic reaction. And when I feel the bottom of the test tube, I can feel that the glass of the test tube is a little warmer. Okay, so next I have to take test tube number 1. Again, this is test tube number 1. And I have to drain the liquid into test tube number 2. So right now I'm just draining the liquid, the used liquid, into test tube number 2. And I'm going to keep the liver in test tube number 1 for later. So right now, again, you can see I'm just draining the liquid from test tube number 1. I took the liquid from test tube number 1 and I poured it into test tube number 2. Okay, well now what? Now I'm going to take test tube number 2 and again, using my forceps, my tweezers here, I'm going to take a fresh piece of liver and I'm going to add it to test tube number 2. And we're going to check and see if there's a reaction. And again, I can use my stirring rod to push the liver all the way down. It kind of gets stuck. The liver is kind of sticky and fresh and raw, so I need to push it all the way down into the used liquid at the bottom. Almost there. There we go. And if I hold this up, you can see that there's no real reaction. This is test tube number 2. There's no reaction. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and mark that observation in my data table. Okay, so now I want to figure out, is this catalase? Remember, there's catalase enzyme in this piece of liver. And this is test tube number 1. I've already used this piece of liver once. I want to figure out, is catalase reusable? So I'm going to take some peroxide, and the directions again tell me to measure 2 milliliters. So using my graduated cylinder, I'm going to measure 2 milliliters, and I need a little bit more. So using my graduated cylinder and my eyedropper, I can accurately measure out 2 milliliters, and there we go, 2 milliliters. So I have 2 milliliters of hydrogen peroxide in my graduated cylinder. And I've already used test tube number 1 once, but let's see what happens when I put this brand new fresh peroxide into test tube number 1, which we've already used once. Let's see what happens. You can see that even though we've already used this piece of liver once, more bubbles formed. So that should prove whether or not catalase is reusable. And I would go ahead and mark my observations in my lab handout. Okay, so here is test tube number 3, and you can see I've added a piece of fresh liver. This liver has not been used before, and I covered it with a little bit of water. So a fresh piece of liver sitting in some water, and we're going to see whether or not heat affects the enzyme's actions. So in this boiling hot water, I'm going to go ahead and set my test tube, and I'm going to let that sit for the next 5 minutes. So I'm going to pause the video right now, and I'll come back 5 minutes later. Okay, so it's been about 5 minutes. I'm going to use my test tube clamp here to remove the hot test tube from the water so I don't burn myself. And I'm going to carry it over to my lab area. Okay, now I have to let it cool off for a few minutes because I don't want to burn myself. So I'm going to just set that in the rack, and I'm going to let it cool off for a few minutes. I'll be right back. Okay, test tube number 3 has cooled enough. You can see I can touch it and not worry about burning myself. And I've already drained the little bit of water that I added. So the only thing in here is the cooked piece of liver. And we're trying to see, does heat have an effect on enzyme activity? So I'm going to slide test tube number 3 into my holder here. And I've already measured 2 milliliters of fresh hydrogen peroxide. And I'm going to add the fresh peroxide into test tube number 3, and we're going to see if there's a reaction. Here we go. When I hold it up, you can see that there's very little bubbles at the bottom, if any bubbles that are formed from this piece of liver. And so I'm going to make that observation in my data table on my lab handout. Again, test tube number 3, the heated liver, heated for 5 minutes. You can see that there's very little bubbles, if any, produced in this example. Okay, so now I'm going to work on test tube number 4. And test tube number 4 asks that I obtain a chilled piece of liver. And you can see in my ice cooler here, I have some liver sitting in a beaker. So I can use my tweezers. I can use my tweezers to obtain a piece of chilled liver. Here's chilled fresh liver. It's really cold. It's been sitting in the ice. and I'm going to put it in test tube number 4. And so test tube number 4 has a piece of really cold chilled liver. And next, I'm going to measure 2 milliliters of chilled hydrogen peroxide. Again, this peroxide's been also sitting in the ice bucket all day, so I need 2 milliliters of it, so I can measure using my graduated cylinder 2 milliliters of chilled peroxide. Need a little more. So 2 milliliters of chilled peroxide. And there you go. You can see that I have 2 milliliters of chilled peroxide. So what happens now? Test tube number 4. Here's again test tube number 4. It's got a piece of really cold liver in here. And I'm going to add chilled peroxide to this really cold liver. Does cold affect the enzyme's reaction? Let's find out. Notice when I added the cold peroxide to the really cold liver, we still have a pretty good amount of bubbles. The bubbles go almost to the same height as before. You can see that the bubbles have stopped maybe about an inch from the top. So even though the liver was cold, even though the peroxide was cold, there's still a high rate of reaction. I would mark this observation in my lab handout. Okay, so now we're working on part C. I want to figure out what effect does pH have on the enzyme's actions and ability to perform its function. So here is test tube number 5, and the directions say to add 2 milliliters of peroxide to test tube number 5. So I've already measured out 2 milliliters of hydrogen peroxide, and I'm going to add it to test tube number 5. Okay, so now test tube number 5 has 2 milliliters of hydrogen peroxide in it. And the directions tell me to add a piece of liver that's been sitting in this acidic solution. So here's a piece of liver that's been sitting in the acidic solution. I'm going to add it to test tube number 5, and let's see if there's an enzyme reaction. When I hold it up so you can see better, you can see this enzyme, you can see that there's very little enzyme activity here because there's no bubbles. So test tube number 5, no reaction whatsoever. Go ahead and mark that observation in your lab handout. So now we're ready to move on to test tube number 6. And the directions tell me, again, to add 2 milliliters of hydrogen peroxide. I've already measured 2 milliliters of hydrogen peroxide. I'm going to add this into test tube number 6. So right now, test tube number 6 has 2 milliliters of hydrogen peroxide. And the directions tell me I'm going to add a piece of liver that's been soaking and sitting in this alkaline or basic solution. We're going to add this, so I need to pick out a piece. There we go. I'm going to add this piece of liver that's been soaking in the alkaline or basic solution. I'm going to add it to test tube number 6. And we're going to look for enzyme reactions here. Notice, you can see, here come the bubbles. They're coming up pretty quickly. And after only a few seconds, you can see the bubbles are almost 3/4 of the way to the top, 80% of the way to the top, 90% of the way to the top. So we can see, even though these pieces of liver, even though the liver was exposed to a basic or alkaline solution, we can see the rate of reaction is almost to the top. The bubbles almost went all the way to the top of the test tube. Go ahead and make this observation, test tube number 6, make this observation in your data table.